I read the scripts. I was lucky enough to read 5, I think, before we started, and I just fell in love with Kathleen. There's something just really lovely about her. She's front of house. She's a politician's wife. She's incredibly important in their little world, but she's still a woman who stays at home and doesn't have a job. And so that's quite odd to play. She does have a job. She has a role within their world, but it's very odd to sort of play the woman at home. But they are these amazing women, and of course she does through the series. She does things
are revealed.
Grow, and we learn much more about what we see some of going on underneath the surface there.
But it's that whole thing about which is so beautifully played in that scene where she has to take the stage, which is obviously difficult for her.
Which is horrifying.
But it's all about the
like
bearing, isn't it? No, it's not like this. But everything about her bearing and her speech, and it's that way of address, which, I mean, Lucy, also you would have too in your character, that slightly sort of more diffident, slightly formal way that women presenting themselves.
Yes, and playing that, being a woman now in comparison to that. It's something that I had to fight, and actually Stephen is very good at saying, bring it back.
It's an extraordinary type of women, because if you had said, if I'd said to my daughter, played brilliantly by Lilia Stokowski, in 2 years' time you're going to be wearing mini skirts, and it was such an extraordinary age of there was so much energy going into technology, and we represent the older generation, and it's a beautiful piece, I think, about youth in all shapes and forms, and energy and life, and and that girls would be practicing sexual freedom. I mean, you just can't. 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That was the timescale.
And yet there's clearly also a sense of anxiety at the time, amongst slightly old, well, not even just older people,
and the
young people
as well. What was going on? What was happening?
The world all about to go?
Exactly. Yeah. Was the world going to blow up? And
it's too dissimilar from now.
Yeah.
Parallels. Is the world going
what's
to blow
going
up?
happening? Yeah.
But it isn't. It's true. I have children, and it's the same thing now. There is anxiety about what the future holds. So there are those parallels.
Helen, if I can bring you in here, I mean, you have worked with Stephen since the turn of the century, pretty much. Which sounds like a hell of a long time, doesn't it? But there must be. I mean, if you look at this production and other Stephen Poliakoff productions, there are often many things. For example, very often period, very often involving wonderful locations and many people, scenes with many people in their own particular challenges, I would have thought.
Yes, I mean, the beauty of working with Stephen is that whenever you crack open the script, you absolutely know that his ambition is going to be impossible. And so you have to find a way to take his magical words and put them on the screen so that everybody can enjoy them. And so over the years we've found there's lots of tricks of trade. Yeah, but essentially you have to basically go for the biggest and then work backwards. Otherwise it won't ever work. You can't put it in a cupboard. It's impossible. Yeah. And so over the years, and also because it's always family as well. So you inevitably know when you read a Stephen script that you're going to be inside a house, but you're also going to be outside of Buckingham Palace at 4 o'clock in the morning. Gosh, yeah, with all those girls getting ready and not being able to get them on the set until 7 o'clock in the morning, and then all the tourists coming at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. It was terrifying. But we did it, but that's what you have to do. You have to be constantly ambitious for the show, or
it was worth it. That scene looks almost like it's been CGI. You're thinking, is this...
It's real.
And it's real. Yeah.
And the weather was wonderful too.
Well, the summer was wonderful.
Yeah,
the summer
yeah.
of rockets, and
Yeah.
we got so lucky.
Yeah, well,
Apart
yeah.
from the first
We had 2 weeks inside the glorious weather. When we went out for a big scene involving Keeley, it poured with rain the whole day. So yeah, we were. We
not
could have
when we
been
wanted
luckier,
it to,
but
for the
we
pouring
were.
with rain.
It was a good summer. It was a good summer. Yeah, the fear of, I think, even as a child, I remember at that time that the fear of nuclear war was so strong, was so palpable in the air that, you know, that something might happen. And there was these huge images of the Russians parading their big missiles on their May Day parades, and they were shown on television. Everybody had a telly by, well, not everybody, but a lot of the population had a telly by now, which was very recent after the coronation. 53 to 58 was explosion of telly ownership, and so they saw these images for the first time from around the world, and it was, rather than hearing about it on the radio, and it was very frightening, and we have echoes of it now. It's like twitches of the Cold War coming back, as we know, especially this country in relation to Russia after the Salisbury poisonings and everything, and maybe they interfered in democracy. You know, so those shadows are coming back a little bit, but they were so strong at that time, and then there was the enormous paranoia about anybody that had come from Russia any time comparatively recently was under suspicion, possibly from the possibly up to no good, possibly up to espionage, and that's why my father fell under suspicion.
But in a sense, when you have a drama and you want to demonstrate that anxiety, I mean, you can't be didactic about it. You can't say people were very anxious. I mean, that is playing out in this through so many scenes of tension. I mean, so many scenes where you're waiting for somebody, or something may have gone horribly wrong, or you may not be getting in to be presented to the Queen, or whatever it is. There's a sort of real sense of anxiety that I think runs through the whole screenplay.
Yes, I mean, that is a reflection of the time, but also that's the autobiographical side a bit. My father's business was perilously poised, bankruptcy threatened because they were very ambitious. They created the first hearing aid with a volume control. Nobody thought of that before, that you could actually switch it up and down. It seems amazing now that nobody thought of it, but they're done. But that made their hearing aid slightly more expensive than everybody else's, so that was a problem. And they weren't brilliant business, they weren't ruthless businessmen. So they were always teetering on the edge of, until much later on when it prospered to a degree. That was a feature of my upbringing as well. But it was a time of enormous, obviously, conformity. The girls were still meant to dress like their mothers. As Lucy said, that was about to explode, but it was just. And in Hannah's character, that we, through the story, we begin to see her rebelling and a whiff of the 60s on her. Yeah, I mean, that sense of it life being very insecure is from my own life, really.
Yeah, and as you were saying, Lucy, that things don't turn, overnight. I think it's often quite interesting when one actually is put back through some work of fiction or whatever into a time, imaginatively, to realise actually how close a lot of things are still. I mean, people are still bringing new technology into the home, and people saying, "Oh, it's too big," it's television screens or whatever it is. That sense of that. In a sense, reactions don't change, do they?
No, well, we were talking about this before the screening. My mum doesn't possess a mobile phone or a computer. She's absolutely terrified of those things. And the phone that she has still got big numbers on it, and. Things are going at such a rate of knots. I mean, I read this thing the other day where they said the children are developing larger thumbs and fingers because they're using computers and so much more. I mean, and so nothing changes. That's just how it was back then. Things were, but it was. I think really things were about to burst in a way that they hadn't burst before. And women were going to start working, and so it was it was a really exciting time.
But exactly. But of course, women had been working during the war, and then there's the sudden moment where suddenly, and the shadow. I suppose that's the other thing, is that the shadow of the Second World War is still very much present. Obviously, there's that idea of your character being married to the war hero. So it is sort of poised between this threat of possible terrifying conflagration ahead and the very real experience of war just before.
Yes, I mean, the shadow of the boarding school that I went to, that I portray a bit of here, the school itself was so Dickensian, I had to water it down because I thought it would seem so over the top. My school was, but there was the shadow of the war, that the masters, some of them had been injured in the war, and there was a sort of rage that their lives had been so disrupted, and they took it out on the boys, and we, the war films, and that one was raised on, and they were shown, and we were allowed to watch a film every month or something. It was always a war film, and so that story of the war still haunted, as it still does, haunt often our sense of identity. But I think that the main issue was that that the world, it's difficult for us to, because since the Berlin Wall's come down, that the whole world could go up at any moment, and it's different, and it's from moment to moment, and that was a daily sort of ticking often in people's consciousness, and it was too frightening to think about sometimes. So, and as a child, to hear your parents whisper about it at the table was really, because you sensed something was so enormous, but you didn't want to really take it in, and wanted to get some of that sense. That's the point of that episode when Lily looks up, Hannah looks up at the trees and imagines it falling on Buckingham Palace.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, anti-Semitism does, the theme does recur through this piece. I hope, and there's an important plot development that involves it later on in the series. But I wanted it to be quite subtle initially, and it's there's very few, there are very few Jews in British drama for some reason. Since the death of the great Jack Rosenthal, we haven't had a lot of Jewish characters portrayed. It's not often remarked. There are statistically not a lot of Jewish people in this country compared to the rest of the population. So that may be one reason. But but nevertheless, it is striking how few Jewish characters there are in British drama, and also they're often portrayed in orthodox settings, and it's all about like the recent Rachel Weisz movie, whereas there's a whole other strand of the Jewish émigré story of people wanting to assimilate, still proud of their culture, but very much assimilated, and that is very much where Samuel comes from, where my father came from, and that. I don't think I've ever seen. It's rarely dramatized in British stories, so that's one point. But obviously, anti-Semitism is a huge issue at the moment, and a terribly worrying one. That it's I never thought it would come back in my lifetime in the way that it has, and the terrible thing about the 50s. The anti-Semitism in the 50s was that it was obviously so close to the revelation of the Holocaust. So close, and yet people were writing very, powerful people that were in Parliament or were important, supposedly knowledgeable people were. Parading the anti-Semitism again in all sorts of ways in the late 50s, and that is, in the 50s generally, and that is extraordinary given that the knowledge that they had of what had happened during the war. So it's shocking now, and it was shocking then.
Who would like to tackle?
Well, I think the Cold War did go away with Gorbachev and Glasnost in the early 90s, and the melting of the fact that they weren't going to, the sense that a misunderstanding or something would mean that there was nuclear war, or even a misunderstanding, let alone belligerence. So I think that it's a different fear now, isn't it? It's in a sense, it's people creeping around Salisbury and doing extraordinary things and then appearing on the telly and saying we were just Tories. But the blatant lies of the Cold War have come back and being offered up to the world to believe. And it is, as somebody who's partly Russian, it is a bit tragic to see that that we've got thinking of them as the enemy again, and Gavin Williamson saying there's very belligerent things, our Defence Secretary, about them. So there is a bit of a return of the Cold War, and that's not a happy development. Who knows? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen from week to week at the moment, so it's impossible to say how things are going to develop. But there are echoes, and there are other echoes in this story. That in 1958, the country was reeling still from the humiliation of the Suez fiasco, which comes feature a bit that sense in the story, and of course we are told we are now the laughingstock of the world because of the Brexit fiasco. So the sense of some people really caring about the image of the country and how it had ended up in terms of the eyes of the world does play a part in this story. So there are quite a few echoes, some of which I didn't realise was going to happen, obviously, because I conceived the story some time ago, but I let it sit and sort of gradually grow in my mind, and I conceived it before the whole Brexit thing's vote. But there are some echoes, especially later on in the story.
Well, Stephen has written and is directing the show, which is very unusual, and that's always very helpful. We have lots of rehearsal time, which is also very unusual for television. Usually we don't get any at all. So all of that is very helpful. It also helps that I had read 5 of the episodes, and so I know what's going on with her in advance, and so I'm able to think about those things while I'm playing the scenes that are early on that nobody else yet knows about. So yeah, I mean each one of them is different, but and approached in a different way. But ultimately, it begins with the writing and where that takes me. And I think I don't know. I suppose everybody's different, and actors all approach their roles in different ways. But yeah, that's where it always starts with me. And all of these characters are so beautifully drawn and written, and it's so rich on the page. I mean, I read these episodes like I was streaming them. I mean, I just read them and then and that's always so telling when that happens, because usually it translates.
It's hard work.
And it did. And it's hard.
Usually it's hard work.
Yes.
But Lucy, do you need backstory? Do you give backstory? Well, there's a certain element of backstory that comes out in the script anyway, but do you require...
I think sometimes when the writing isn't so good, you need to do a lot of research yourself. With this, the world was there. And, we had a wonderful, wonderful designer on it, Michael Pickwood, who... You just walked into his sets and it was like, there's the world, and wonderful costume designer. Sometimes it's just like that. It's the world's just there, and Stephen's imagination is so vivid and huge, and all these characters are so wonderfully eccentric, and also I think because of your personal attachment to it, it felt imbued with love. There was a warmth about it, which again I think is rare in TV these days, to find that love in a piece, that warmth. And I mean that was the first time I've seen it today, and I think it really portrays that on screen. Wonderful world.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. We're sort of out of time now, but Lucy, Keeley, Helen, and Stephen, thank you very much indeed.